Alrighty, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the characters. Basically, when I say characters, I mean who are we reading about? Now, I think it's really important to mention firstly the protagonist. So the protagonist is basically the main character. It's not necessarily the good guy per se, but in this book we can just assume that it is. So our protagonist for Pride and Prejudice is Elizabeth Bennet. Now, most of you guys may have heard this name before, maybe not so much, but Elizabeth Bennet is basically one of the Bennet sisters. So there are 5 Bennet sisters, and she is the second sister, okay? And she's probably the most witty and intelligent sister. She's about 20 years old, so she's getting a little bit older in terms of the expected marriage date. And she probably doesn't have as much of a preference for marriage the way her younger sisters do, okay? Because Elizabeth, she values intelligence over the whole marriage prospect. Although she is a bit of a romantic in some aspects, she would not die for marriage the way her younger sisters would. Because her younger sisters, obviously, they're a bit more immature, but Elizabeth has reached an age where it's not the most important thing in the world. Now, Elizabeth Bennet, she clashes with another character, which we know as Mr. Darcy, and she immediately has this hostile attitude towards him because of the way he treats her. So obviously we see that Elizabeth Bennet, she doesn't really like arrogance or attitude, and if someone shows her that kind of attitude, she immediately builds up a wall against them and she judges them and has a prejudice. So as we can see, she represents the prejudice in the title of the novel. Another thing that is worth mentioning for Elizabeth Bennet is, despite her being the representation of prejudice in the book, eventually she spends more time with Mr. Darcy, and this wall eventually starts to fall, the prejudice that she has against him, that is. So eventually this prejudice deteriorates. The next character we're going to talk about is Fitzwilliam Darcy, or as we know him as, Mr. Darcy. Now, Mr. Darcy is one of the most wealthy characters in the novel. He is known to be very picky with his women because he doesn't really like Elizabeth at first because he insults her. He basically says that she's not good looking enough and that he can do better than her, which basically insults her ego. Now, because he's so rich, a lot of women chase after him, but he just takes no notice to them at all. I believe he's about 28 years old compared to Elizabeth's 20 years old, and he represents the pride in the book because he doesn't like poor people. Because he's so rich, he's never really paid attention to the lower class. So obviously this is what he doesn't really like about Elizabeth. The fact that she has a prejudice against him, but also the fact that she's of a lower class to him. The more time he spends with Elizabeth, the less hostile he is towards her, and the more he finds that he is starting to crush on her, really. So kind of like Elizabeth, the pride that he represents starts to deteriorate because he's realizing, hey, this girl's not so bad. Just because she's poorer than me, she's pretty cool. Yeah, so he admires her intelligence, and eventually the matter of class starts to fade away. Moving on, we're going to have a chat about Jane Bennet. So out of the 5 Bennet sisters, she is the eldest of them all. She is 22 years old, and she's known to be the more gentle and the most beautiful of the sisters. And this is what men love about her so much, is the fact that she's so reserved and humble and sweet. And this is actually what captures the attention of a millionaire guy called Charles Bingley. Now, obviously back then, it wouldn't have been millionaire because their currency was different to how it is now. But she captures the attention of Charles Bingley, which is Mr. Darcy's best friend, and eventually they get married. The next character we're going to have a look at is Charles Bingley, or Mr. Bingley, as the characters refer to him as. So Mr. Bingley is the suitor that chases after Jane Bennet. So this is actually quite a contrast to Mr. Darcy, because Mr. Darcy does not like poor people, and he only will speak to people who are of the same class as him. But Mr. Bingley, he's the complete opposite, because he's like, hey, I don't see you for your class, I see you because you're cool, yeah? Which is basically how he meets Jane Bennet, because he notices her for her personality and her looks, not for where she comes from. And basically, he serves as a direct contrast to Mr. Darcy in the end. And next we're going to have a look at Mr. Bennet. So Mr. Bennet is the father of the 5 Bennet sisters. He is actually quite a sarcastic fellow, and we find that he has a really interesting relationship with his wife, Mrs. Bennet, because Mrs. Bennet is very loud and boisterous, but Mr. Bennet is very sarcastic and he likes to make fun of his wife because he knows that it makes her angry. So every time his wife brings up marriage for his 5 daughters, he makes fun of her and he intentionally gets her mad. Mr. Bennet's favourite of the 5 daughters is going to be obviously Elizabeth, because she does not prioritise marriage the way her other sisters do, and because of this and because of her intelligence, she is Mr. Bennet's favourite. Let's talk about Mrs. Bennet. Mrs. Bennet is obviously married to Mr. Bennet, and she is the mother of the 5 Bennet sisters. So she's very loud, she's very annoying, she's very boisterous, and this is because she is obsessed with marriage for her 5 daughters. The reason being, when she was younger, she came from a very poor background, and she's only comfortable now because she married Mr. Bennet. So she wants her 5 daughters to have wealthy marriages, and we see her throughout the entire novel trying to hook up Jane with Bingley and Elizabeth with Mr. Darcy. So yeah, that is Mrs. Bennet in a nutshell. The next characters we're going to talk about are the remaining 3 Bennet sisters. So the next Bennet sister of the 5, we have Mary Bennet, which is the middle sister, and basically she's a book nerd. She loves looking at books, and she doesn't really care for marriage either, just like Elizabeth. So we find that Elizabeth and Mary have a really interesting and understanding relationship with each other. And then the next sister we have is Lydia Bennet. But Lydia Bennet is the most obsessed sister in terms of marriage. Like, all she wants in life is to get married to a hot soldier, get a big amount of money, and live comfortably. So basically, she's the most gold digger-ish character in the entire book. And she's only 15. She's literally only 15, but she wants to get married ASAP. So Lydia actually causes quite a lot of problems with the family because of how much she's obsessed with boys. And eventually, she ends up eloping with George Wickham, which means she secretly ran away with him and got married to him. So obviously, this caused a lot of problems for the family, and they were not happy with her. And obviously, in the end, Mr. Bennet was really salty towards her. Catherine Bennet is the youngest sister of the group, but she's nicknamed Kitty. So basically, she is the youngest of the group, so she's the most impressionable. So basically, everything Lydia does, she follows. So those two basically come as a matching set, and they're obsessed with boys together. Now, the next character, moving away from the Bennet family, is George Wickham. So George Wickham has a very dark past, but we don't know that yet in the beginning. So initially, Elizabeth Bennet is like, ooh, this boy's fine. But eventually she finds out that his past is not that fine, because he claims that he and Mr. Darcy had a really troubling past because Mr. Darcy cheated him out of his inheritance. So obviously this causes Elizabeth to hate Darcy even more because she thinks that he's a cheater, basically, and that Wickham is the victim. But we learn later on that it's not so much Wickham that's the victim, but rather Darcy, because eventually she realizes that Wickham lied to her about everything, and that Darcy was the one that was wronged by Wickham. My favourite character, not really, but my favourite character is Mr. Collins. So he's the most pompous, self-righteous character in the novel because he's this short little stubby man, and he's kind of like a cousin of the Bennets, but back then incest wasn't really a thing. So he tried to marry any of the sisters. Any of the 5 sisters he was willing to marry. But Elizabeth in particular is who caught his eye. So this character, Mr. Collins, he likes to talk highly about himself. He always brags about how he works for a very rich woman called Lady Catherine, and he thinks that even though he's a middle-class person, that he deserves to be upper class. So he's very self-righteous is the right word to describe him. And he ends up proposing to Elizabeth literally one day after meeting her, and she rejects his proposal. Eventually he marries Charlotte Lucas, which is Elizabeth's bestie. So Charlotte Lucas is Elizabeth's best friend, and she's a little bit older than Elizabeth, so she's perhaps around 21 to 23 years old, and she's a bit lower class than Elizabeth. So Elizabeth is of a upper middle class, but Charlotte is of a middle lower class. And because of this, she really needs to marry into a somewhat wealthy family so that she can have a future. And eventually she marries Mr. Collins because she realizes that she's getting old and that she needs to secure a safe and wealthy future, or else she's going to be left for dead, basically. So this is basically the opposite of Elizabeth, because Elizabeth wants to marry for love, which is why she keeps rejecting her mother's offers, whereas Charlotte will do whatever it takes to get married, no matter how loveless the marriage is. The last character we're going to talk about is Georgiana Darcy. So obviously the last name means that she's related to Mr. Darcy. She is his younger sister. Basically it's just the two of them, yeah? There's Mr. Darcy and then there's Georgiana. She is more than 10 years younger than him. She's only 16 years old, whereas he is 28. And her past is really dark as well, kind of like Wickham, because she was the reason why Wickham and Darcy had beef. And it's because Wickham tried to marry Georgiana so that he could get her money, basically. So Wickham is a gold digger and tried to gold dig Georgiana. And obviously this caused problems between him and Darcy was like, bro, get out of here, get out of my house. So yeah, Georgiana is very sweet and innocent, and she's Mr. Darcy's younger sister, and he's very protective of her. Alrighty guys, so that brings us to the very end of our video. So thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you guys got something out of it. And if you guys liked anything in particular, or if you have any other questions, don't be afraid to drop a comment down below, and we're more than happy to help you guys out. But if you guys would like some more in-person advice and more tips and tricks, don't be afraid to check out our website at www.sactutoring.com, and you can check out which classes are available and convenient for you guys. And don't forget to follow our socials. We're available on Instagram and Facebook. It's at Sac Tutoring. And yeah, don't be afraid to drop in. We're very nice and friendly. And we'll see you guys next time on Sac Tutoring.